Subject, of course, is John Lennon. The book that Lesley Ann's written has a subtitle, The Lives, Loves and Deaths of the Greatest Rock Star. And I couldn't disagree with that, honestly. When John Lennon got killed in 1980, I was a young reporter on the Birmingham Mail, and I have to say, it had a devastating effect on me and has had that effect on me ever since. I still mourn the loss of... He was 40, John Lennon, when he was murdered on the streets of New York outside the Dakota building, and I still mourn his loss. And the reason I mourn his loss is because how many records would he have made in the 40 years since? How many great compositions have we been denied because he's not been around? And, you know, it's extraordinary. Now, Lesley Ann, the title, Who Killed John Lennon? The reason I think she's called it that is because she's got fantastic insight into the life of John Lennon, the complex and sometimes weird sort of character he was, and what he exactly, what his aim was in life, where he was going, what he wanted to do, the reasons for so many things that he did. And it is a fascinating book. I've read all the books on John Lennon. This is the latest and the greatest. I think it's probably going to go to the top of the bestseller list. But whatever, it is a major piece of work. And delighted to say, on the line now, Lesley Ann Jones. Lesley Ann, good evening, my dear.
Hello, Mr. Parry. How are we this evening?
Very well indeed. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Lesley Ann, I've been mumbling on about the title, Who Killed John Lennon, but you're the person there who wrote it. Perhaps you could tell us why, when it's obvious that there is a man in jail serving life for murdering John Lennon. Why did you call it Who Killed John Lennon?
It was very obvious to me that the John Lennon who exists in the modern memory was so far removed from the John who existed as to be a completely different person. So I went in search of the original John, and I wanted to know when that John Lennon had died.
I see. So I mean, look, that's a bit of psychosis there and all that kind of stuff. Didn't you say to me once when we were talking about the subject as you were writing the book that you thought that John Lennon probably wanted to die from his teenage years onwards?
He had no respect for his life. Even his first wife, Cynthia, said from the very early days when they were still teenagers, she felt that he didn't care whether he lived or died.
Yeah.
So from the age of about 17, which was the time when his mother died, Julia Lennon, who was knocked down outside his home and killed by a car.
Yeah, absolutely shocking. And how did this manifest himself? I mean, he did become an addict, didn't he, on certain things? I think he was a heroin addict at one point, wasn't he? And was he particularly reckless with his life that led people to believe that he didn't really care about living?
I think once he worked out as a child that he'd been abandoned effectively by both parents. So his mother gave him away to her sister Mimi.
Yes.
His father legged it on the high seas and didn't reappear until John was 20.
Yes.
And so he didn't feel wanted. He was very dysfunctional. He was in a stable home with Auntie Mimi and Uncle George for a while, but then Uncle George died. He was the only one John related to. And of course, Uncle George had awoken John's creativity.
Yeah.
By teaching him to do crosswords and read the papers, how to sketch and draw and paint and all those things, none of which Mimi respected. She used to throw his paintings and drawings away.
I know.
And he actually said to her at one point, you'll be sorry one day, Mimi, because I'm going to be famous.
Yeah.
Then you'll be sorry.
Yeah, but she had the view, didn't she, that you can't earn a living playing a guitar.
Yeah, she wanted John to be a good grammar school boy who grew up to be a lawyer or a doctor or an accountant. And of course, the only thing that mattered to John was music.
That's right. He says, doesn't he, in one part of the book, or you say for him, they were always trying to beat me into being a teacher or a dentist. And I never wanted to be a teacher or a dentist. Nobody would understand what else I did. One question I want to ask you, Lesley Ann, is because I'm an avid Beatles fan, as you know, but did John Lennon ever smile? I mean, apart from sniggering at his own rather cruel humour, was he ever nice to people? Was it, could anybody ever say he was a close friend or anything like that? He always seemed to carry a chip on his shoulder, like he didn't really like the rest of the world.
He didn't like himself was the key, but there are some pictures in this book of John smiling, especially with Johnny Hamp, the Granada television executive.
Sure.
He was the first person to put the Beatles on television, and he and John forged quite a close relationship.
Yeah.
But if you look at John's smile, it never actually reaches the eyes.
No.
It's just in the bottom half of his face.
Yeah.
So I think he was a deeply unhappy person.
he was a deeply unhappy person.
Yes, all his
Yeah,
life.
yeah,
And
yeah.
if you think he was only 40 when he
Despite the
died,
fact
so
that he was probably the most famous rock star in the world, didn't he get any satisfaction out of achievements?
for about 5 minutes.
And
But
yeah,
the touring years of the Beatles were never satisfying because they could never hear themselves perform.
no,
And then the Beatles ended effectively as a touring band in 1966.
yeah,
After that, they were a studio band for a few years.
mm,
But of course, then McCartney and Wings are out there touring the world
yes.
and getting great accolades and acclaim. And all John wanted was to be in a rock and roll band doing what Paul was doing.
Yeah, I see. And that was the complication. That was the famous joke, wasn't it? When he was asked after one of the great American concerts, Shea Stadium or something, don't you mind that you can't hear your own songs? He said, no, we can go home and play them. We've got copies of them at home. I mean, that was
Yeah, I
his
got
sort
the
of...
records at home.
He
Yeah.
got the records at home, he's right with. Now, his relationship with Brian Epstein's very interesting, of course, and quite complicated. In your book, you say that one of the reasons why the Beatles were made the breakthrough in the first place was because when Brian Epstein approached George Martin, the legendary producer, it was only because Epstein had such utter faith in the Beatles, and George Martin recognised this, that they got a chance at a recording contract.
Well, of course, Brian had been turned down all over the place. Many record companies had said no to the Beatles.
Really?
And yes, but Brian's belief, you're right, was so
Yeah.
fervent. And George recognized that and respected it.
Yeah.
And he agreed to hear them and to try them out.
Yeah, that's astonishing, isn't it? It's one of the most famous quotes ever, isn't it? I think it's all over for bands with guitars. The guy from, was it EMI, who turned them down. But Brian Epstein and John Lennon had a very complicated relationship, didn't they?
Yeah, Brian was in love with John, and John was fighting his inner fag, was the way he described it.
In a fag.
And yeah, he was married to Cynthia by this time.
Yeah.
He had a little baby.
Mm-hmm.
He went when Cynthia was just 3 weeks delivered, the tiny baby left at home with his wife.
Yes.
John went off on holiday to Spain with Brian Epstein.
Mm.
And of course, when he came back, people started teasing him about the honeymoon he'd just been on.
Mm-hmm.
And John would beat people up for that.
Yeah.
He nearly killed the DJ, Bob Wooler, the Cavern Club DJ, at Paul McCartney's 21st birthday party.
Yes.
When Bob, who was a very mild-mannered man,
Mm.
according to reports,
Yeah.
happened to mention this as a joke.
Yeah.
And John went for him.
Blimey. As I say, he was he never really smiled, did he? And it's a very complicated man to work out. But you've done a very good job of working him out. Now, one thing you do in this book, and it's much to your credit, but the whole book's to your credit. But you're actually pretty praiseworthy towards Yoko Ono and the contribution she made to John Lennon's life. And you besmirched the myth that Yoko split up the Beatles.
She didn't break up the Beatles. The Beatles were broken by the time she came along.
Mm-hmm.
What Yoko was John's excuse to walk away from the band, to become a solo artist,
Yeah.
and to go again, to reinvent himself yet again. She gave him the confidence to do that. So she got the blame, but she was not the reason why they moved to America either. The reason they did that was to find her child who'd been abducted.
Yeah, now that's a long and complicated story which didn't resolve itself for 30 years, did it?
John never saw his stepdaughter again, Kyoko, and he idolized her. And Yoko only saw her again after Kyoko had her own daughter. So that was 30 years on.
And so are they now reconciled? Because I paid particular attention to a couple of paragraphs in your book about bouncing this grandchild up on and down on a knee in Strawberry Fields. Now, I'm not talking about Strawberry Fields in Liverpool, obviously. I'm talking about Strawberry Fields in Central Park in New York, a few hundred yards from the Dakota building where John Lennon was mown down on the pavement outside. By the way, before we go any further, I think that Strawberry Fields looks a bit tacky. You know what I mean? I just don't think it's been kept in good shape at all. I don't know how recently you've been there.
Oh, just a couple of years ago, and it's not tacky to me. It's a garden.
Yeah,
and
I know, but
gardens.
I don't think it's kept very well. All the marble used to for the patterns on the ground and all that all looked a bit kind of scruffy to me. And I'm a big Beatles fan. I wanted it to look pristine.
I know what you mean. People visit in vast numbers.
They do,
every
that's
day.
true.
There are people there,
Yeah.
and they spill drinks on it. They leave a sandwich on the side.
Yes.
They lie on it. They put flowers.
Yes.
Everything stains the marble, but it does get cleaned. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story about that actually, Leslie, because we were there. I'm walking through, and there was a bloke sitting on a bench, and he was clearly, under the influence of some sort of substances or something like that. And he had no teeth, but he had a guitar with 4 strings. It wasn't a bass guitar either. And he said, if you give him a couple of dollars, he'll play you a John Lennon song. And we gave him a few dollars, and he started playing "Get Back."
Oh
and,
God.
and we said, "Hang on, mate, what's that?" He said, "It's a." I said, "No, I think Paul McCartney wrote Get Back. Do something else." So then he started playing "Let It Be," and again, I mean, but that's all I'm saying. It was all part of the Lennon circus, because of course that brings me on to the next question: the Lennon myth, or not the myth, but the Lennon legend, and this permeates right the way through your book, is not going anywhere. It's growing, isn't it?
It is growing. And I think this is the thing about a rock star who dies young.
Yeah.
The best thing a rock star can do is die young in terms of keeping the heritage alive, keeping that music eternal. And John Lennon's music is not going anywhere. My children, all 3 of them, absolutely love John Lennon and his music.
Yeah.
But they don't know really very much about him. So now they have to read the book.
Well, I'm sure they've read the book, and they should have read it chapter by chapter as you were writing it.
As it was being written.
That's right. You say, getting towards the conclusions of your book, and I don't want to get towards the conclusion of this, because even now we're getting messages on the screen saying, fantastic and brilliant insight into it and all that kind of stuff. But you described it as being not just a man who was murdered, not just the greatest rock star murdered, but an era was murdered. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, because of what John stood for, really. He was about peace and love. He represented a different way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
And that peace and love era was murdered. The innocence was taken away.
Yes.
And I like to think that if he were still around today, he'd be still very active. He'd be on Twitter and Facebook, and he'd be castigating the government and pouring scorn all over people for the way we've run Brexit and the coronavirus crisis and so on.
Yes.
I think he and Yoko would have been very loud voices today, even at the age of 80.
Yeah, no, I'm sure they would. And referring to Yoko Ono again there, you say she actually had some musical input into what John Lennon did.
Yeah, she was an artist in her own right. And of course, people like to say, well, what was she doing on the record? She couldn't sing, she couldn't play. Actually, she could.
Yeah.
A very credible pianist, by the way, who'd given concerts. She could sing. People don't pour scorn all over Björk, for example.
Yes.
I think Yoko was just ahead of her time.
Yes, not only was she ahead of her time, as you say, but eventually the Lennon estate, because of course John Lennon died in 1980, won the right to credit her with being the co-writer of Imagine, didn't they? Because did she wrote this little book, hadn't she? Was it called Grapefruit or something?
Yes.
And did that give John the vision of a world of peace and love that became the lyrics to Imagine? Is that the way it worked?
Oh, yes. And he did acknowledge that in later years. And in his interview with Andy Peebles from Radio 1, BBC Radio 1, who did the last ever interview with John Lennon by a British broadcaster 2 days before he was murdered, John actually says, she was just the wife at home. So it didn't occur to me to credit her. I just took the credit because that's what one did.
Yeah.
And he wasn't quite enlightened at that point. He became very feminist in later years.
Right. Very feminist, because he used to call Yoko mother as a replacement for his own mother, didn't he?
Yeah, all his life, for the rest of his life, he referred to her and he addressed her as mother. It's very telling, isn't it?
It's very telling indeed. Yoko wasn't overkind to John Lennon, was she? I mean, I've read things before about when he wanted to go out for lunch and, they'd go out the Dakota and go to lunch somewhere and she wouldn't go with him and all this kind of stuff. And then, of course, eventually she arranged for him to push off, didn't she, to the West Coast and take another lover who was, in fact, their PR, wasn't she?
She was an assistant, May Pang, and really that was about John's sex drive. He was, he'd had women all over the world when he was married to Cynthia.
Right.
And Cynthia turned a blind eye. Yoko wasn't going to do that, but she couldn't keep up with John's sex drive. So in the end, she said, well, you may as well take a girlfriend.
Yes.
But she chose the girlfriend. She arranged the affair and sent them off to the West Coast where they could misbehave to their heart's content.
Yeah, absolutely. Now,
according to May, they were in love, and John was actually going to stay with her. But John was begging Yoko pretty much every day on the phone
to go
to
back.
go home.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, because that sort of sense of being and is it true that Yoko had an affair with somebody while she was away? Wasn't there a
Well, she
businessman?
was with Sam Havatoy,
Yes.
a man who was in their circle of friends for some time,
Yeah.
quite soon after John died. I believe that Sam actually stayed in the Dakota with Yoko
Yeah.
on the night that John was killed.
Right.
And there is some suggestion that that relationship was established before John died.
Mm. What was John's relationship like with George Martin? I've got a great passage here from your book. John would stoop to ruining a nice evening by spitting venom into the dinner, as he once did in New York, crushing his companion with the taunt that if he had his way, he'd go back and re-record every last Beatles song. What, even Strawberry Fields? He was asked, and instinctively protective, he said, especially Strawberry Fields, snarled John. He couldn't help himself. That sounds very unpleasant.
It does, yeah. And George did take the brunt of that. You know,
Yeah.
John wasn't respectful. Every other Beatle was respectful of George Martin.
Yes.
But John couldn't concede that to George. George was widely known as the fifth Beatle, and much of his musical knowledge went into making Beatles songs what they were, the recordings.
Yeah.
But John couldn't allow him that bit of credit.
Yeah.
You know, he had to be spiteful about it.
It
just gives this insight, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely.
How John was.
Definitely. I'm sure I saw a bit of video once when John was asked, is George Martin really the fifth Beatle? And he said, how many number one hits has George Martin written? Just snap back like that. You know what I mean? I think you're right. However, George Martin was a creative genius, wasn't he? And you throughout this book, it's clear that if the Beatles hadn't given up touring like the Stones did for the rest of their career, Sgt. Pepper's would never have been written because it took so much time.
It wasn't just about the songs, was it? It was about production and arrangement
Yep.
and innovation. And of course, so few recording techniques were available in those days.
Yeah.
But they experimented and they made the most. They had all kinds of technicians, engineers who were brought into play.
Sure.
So it wasn't just about the songs.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's about musical development, and they took it to extremes, didn't they? And and those extremes, brilliant as they were in those days, are brilliant now. And I think people still give them credit for being revolutionary. Lesley Ann, I want to thank you very much indeed for joining me tonight. Thank you very much indeed. Best of luck with your book, although I'm sure you won't need it. I found it riveting. When I got my copy, I spent a night at home with pizza, Chardonnay, the book in my hand, and Beatles' greatest hits playing on a loop on my ancient CD player. So, Lesley Ann, thank you very much indeed. That was Lesley Ann Jones, the author of Who Killed John Lennon? The Lives, Loves and Deaths of the Greatest Rock Star by Lesley Ann Jones. Right, okay, folks, coming up to the end of this show, but that's not, of course, the end of the action